Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining this radio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the frothy real estate prices, residential real estate primarily. And there are a lot of signs in Sydney, and it's not universal, but there are pockets of it, quite a few pockets actually, real estate prices that are starting to head back towards, still a long way from, but head back towards reality. Now, what is intrinsic value and what is market value and what is overpriced? In other words, not driven by market forces, but by coordinated external forces. So typically residential real estate, certainly in most parts of the world, and certainly up until probably the mid-1990s, maybe a bit before that, real estate typically would follow the purchasing power. This is residential real estate I'm talking about here, would follow the purchasing power of the local population. So if the local population was paid X, then a recognised approximate proportion of that would be dedicated to acquiring a family home, that sort of thing. So you could say that the intrinsic value, which crossed over with market value, but the intrinsic value of the house, or market value if you want in this instance, represents the local purchasing power of the population that are going to be house buying. And that makes perfect sense. So in Australia, at least, the price of housing in, say, the biggest city, Sydney, pretty much tracked along with the purchasing power of the paycheck. So if the average paycheck was X, then the average house price would be Y, and that equation, with some minor variation, stayed pretty constant. Now, immigration or migration into Australia, most of the people coming to Sydney, was pretty robust during this time. So it didn't feed into any overpricing of real estate that was obvious. So when say wages, the average wage was, for example, $4,000 a year. So we're talking like 67 to 69 type 1967 to 1969. Then the average price of a house was sort of 10 or 11,000, around that. And if you wanted to go sort of further out in the suburbs, some of the newer estates, then it was even less. So the average house price was well within the range of really anyone who had a full-time job, or certainly any man who had a full-time. Anyone who had a job in a factory anywhere in Australia could afford to buy a house. That's even the guy who worked in the driveway at the local petroleum gasoline station, the guy who comes out and fills your tank, washes your windscreen and I don't know, tops up your oil, that sort of thing. Those guys, they would make enough money to be able to buy a house and have a family. Such was the purchasing power of the paycheck relative to the cost of real estate at the time, and that relationship stayed pretty tight. Now, the difference between in those days, say, waterfront property and property that was a couple of miles back from the waterfront wasn't really that much. So I'm looking at a price here in 1972. The price, there's it's in a nice upmarket suburb, but the difference between the waterfront property with panoramic water views and the property a mile back, with no views, and it's not far from a rubbish tip, that's maybe $5,000 in it, not even that much. So the difference between prime real estate and just an ordinary house to live in wasn't really that much at the time. So you're looking at, say, 2.5 to 3 years of gross wages would buy you a house, but back in the day. Now so there's quite a bit of inflation when the oil shocks came along in sort of 1972, around there. So house prices had gone up a fair bit. So say taking 1975 as another benchmark. Now there's a house here that sold for $35,000 in 1975. Now that same house sold a year and a half ago for $4.2 million. So $35,000 in 1975, $4.2 million in just as I say, just over a year ago. Now here's another one I'm looking at. Is a house that sold for $25,000 in 1971, and that is also sold for just on $4 million. So that gives you an idea. Now, over that same time, even though the house price increased 100-fold, so let me repeat that, the house price has gone up 100-fold, 100 times. Wages only increased by about 10.6, let's say 11, just to be generous, 11 times. So house prices increased, from 1975 to last year at 10 times the rate of wages. So wages weren't underwriting that. If people weren't making more money or getting paid, there weren't more people with money, then the house prices couldn't reflect purchasing power of the local population, because the local population didn't have that sort of purchasing power. Let's assume, because back in those days, 75, really there was, say, 1.2 incomes per household, whereas now there's 1.8 incomes per household. So a lot of households with a double income. So, and because of the the amount of women entering the workforce and affirmative action quotas, that sort of thing, then the gap between what men and women earn has reduced considerably in the types of employment they have, that sort of thing. So you get a lot of people, both of them are deputy principals in the education system. So that type of thing. So, but if you look at, even if you take the double income thing, then still house prices increased at 2.5 plus times the rate of income, even when you factor in a double income between 1975 and last year. So that's the amount of froth that was in the market that is not underpinned by the purchasing power of the population. Now, the intrinsic value, you can say, is the actual cost of the land and the actual cost of building the house. So the raw cost, if you will, but the land, the price of land has, the valuation of land has changed drastically over the years. So it's hard to get a bead on what intrinsic value may be. So intrinsic value is the value of the user, assuming that they're not just using it as an investment to flip, but it's the value, the utility it has to a buyer for a place to live in. Is it comfortable? Does it have, all the mod cons? Those sorts of things. Be more heading towards the intrinsic value. The market value, or is the local purchasing power. Now, if you tamper with the local purchasing power, which is what's happened all across the West, and you've got international financial firms coming and buying up swathes of real estate, not to mention, Chinese corrupt, monopoly owning multi-gazillionaires that are coming in and buying hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of properties in Australia. And there's not just one or two of them, there are thousands of them, many thousands, tens of thousands of them, vacuuming up properties by the 100 lot. So that's radically altered the economics of what market forces represent. Now let's look at, say, so the year 2000. Now here's a house here, it's in Sydney again, a house that sold for $370,000 in the year 2000, and that sold again last year for $2.3 million. So there's a 5.25 times increase in the house price, when wages approximately doubled in that, well, not quite doubled in that time. So wage growth has been fairly modest. Now, let's extrapolate back. That house that sold for $375,220, if we just had it tracking along with wages, And bear in mind that the tax rates and the amount of contribution into retirement funds has gone up. So, it would even be less than this if we looked at net wages, that is net after tax and after retirement fund savings, that sort of thing, which are mandatory here in Australia on a percentage basis. So if we look at that, then the house prices increased at more than double the rate of wages. Now, if we go from which means the house should be at a maximum, say today, assuming we use year 2000 as a benchmark, it should be $750,000 tops. Probably less than that in reality, but if we look at net wages, but $750,000 absolute maximum if it had stuck approximately with wages. Now, it's even worse if we look at, say, 1975, the house that was 35,000 odd and then sold recently for over $4 million. That house price would be maybe $400,000 if we just look at purchasing power alone and use 1975 as a benchmark. So this gives you an idea as the amount of overvaluation that's in Sydney and other parts of Australia. In Sydney real estate, it's vastly exceeded all purchasing power, again, even if you assume two incomes. Now, where you assume two incomes, you're generally seeing a situation where they're having fewer children or no children. And there's a difference between people that have a certain amount of wealth where they may be able to hire full-time nannies, that sort of stuff. So, but looking at that, the real estate's way overvalued. So recently, there's a house that some people we knew bought for $3.4 million, and that's about a year ago, and that's because of the interest rate rises and the COVID-related reduction in investment money, offshore investment money sloshing around. The price of real estate fell, or the price of that house fell, close to $1 million. Now, so that's almost a 30% drop. But again, if you look at that house, say, from 1975 value, it should be somewhere in the region of maybe 290,000 in reality, in today's, in relation to purchasing power at least. Now, wage purchasing power in Australia is going down. Every time they bring out a new bunch of migrants, from the third world, which they're hell-bent on doing, as per the globalist masters that tell them to do it, the government brings in these people. That reduces the purchasing power of the paycheck, the individual paycheck. And more people are having to live communally if they intend to be able to have any sort of quality of life, which is why the Indians and the Chinese can live 3 and 4 generations in one house, which is something they may do normally in their own countries, but it's not normal and not usual in the West, where for a long time now there's been sufficient wealth for people to live independently. But that's obviously disappearing again. The globalist "you'll own nothing and be happy" mantra. So just looking at this, real estate has, if it's going to meet the purchasing power test and thus the market, which is the real market, the local purchasing power of the local people that want to live there, then that's going to be, it's got a long way to go. Now, politicians today in Australia and I think elsewhere, they make most of their income not from their wage or benefits or generous expense accounts from being politicians. They make most of their money from real estate investment these days. So, and that's been so ever since the real estate prices went hysterical. The politicians somehow magically managed to be at the head of the queue on that one. Wonder how, must just be coincidence. So they get most of their income from real estate speculation. They're hardly likely to want to let that go, given that even the average wage and benefits for a politician is maybe $200,000 a year, which isn't a lot of money. I mean, if you live in Sydney, it's not a lot of money. But they can be making $500,000 a year plus with real estate speculation, and without that, they'd be living a fairly ordinary life in the big cities, which has now become very expensive to live in, particularly if you want to live in a nice area, the tree-lined street and all that sort of stuff. Even houses in areas where you wouldn't want to live unless you're in big trouble. Even there, the house prices are still well ahead of what local purchasing power is. So the real estate prices have a long way to go if they're going to meet reality at any time soon, or at any time at all, really. So just looking at, say, the house that's 350,000 in reality, if it had just been tracking with wage purchasing power, that sold for over 4 million. We got to realise that these house prices have to drop 70-80% if they're going to come back to earth. That's the extent of the fantasy pricing and the froth that we're seeing in not simply real estate, office real estate as well, but also share prices. Share prices have no resemblance to any reality or any intrinsic value, such as the profitability of the company and that sort of thing. So this is something for us all to think about. And as interest rates increase, it's going to more and more bring things back to reality. Remember, the interest rate's been artificially low for something like 20 years. And if they come back to really a market sort of average rate, then they're going to be much higher. They've still got quite a way to go. I remember in the days when interest rates, when I was paying a mortgage, you went up to 17%, for Christ's sakes. My mortgage payments more than doubled during that time. So that was a bit of a squeeze for a lot of people. But the prices need to fall a considerable amount. They came back to these people, that bought the house for $3.4 million. It's now worth ballpark 2.4, 2.5. I don't know how big the mortgage they have is. It can't be massive, but they live a very expensive lifestyle. The cars they drive, the kids all go to the most expensive private schools, that sort of thing. I mean, they need a household income of $500,000 a year gross. That's gross, meaning before tax and before retirement savings deductions. And they need that just to be able to pay the school fees, put food on the table, run the cars, have their annual vacation. That's before they even service any mortgage. But if they sold up today with selling costs and the other bits thrown in, they probably lose around $1 million. So I doubt they could afford to take a hit of that size, or maybe they could. I don't know. But it goes to show you how people that bought at the frothy top and borrowed heavily would be in quite a precarious position. Now, the banks used to accept, not that long ago, the banks would accept a 5% deposit because the market was so frothy. Then they upped to 10%. And then not long ago, not all the banks, but quite a few of them started asking for 20% deposits. And but even on a 20% deposit, people that borrowed that money on a 20% deposit and are looking at the sort of price declines that we're now seeing around Sydney, then they're going to have, by the time they've paid everything back, they're going to walk out without a penny in their pocket. And for people in their mid 40s and so on, that's a heavy hit to try and start again. You've been a Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.